If admitting a mistake threatens the image you have of yourself, your mind will prefer to distort reality rather than modify that image. That is the hypothesis. Self-deception is not a deliberate lie. It is not that a person sits down to invent a false story while knowing it is false. It is something more sophisticated. It is a defense mechanism whose main objective is not to deceive the world, but to preserve the internal coherence of the self. The human mind prioritizes the stability of identity over objective truth. If information contradicts the narrative you have about who you are, I am responsible, I am a good person, I am intelligent, I always do my best. Your psychological system experiences internal tension. That tension is known as cognitive dissonance. Cognitive dissonance is not simply discomfort, it is a structural threat to identity. And when that threat appears, the brain activates automatic strategies to reduce it. One of those strategies is rationalization. Rationalization does not consist of inventing an absurd lie. It consists of constructing a plausible explanation that preserves your self-image. For example, a person who fails in a project may attribute the result exclusively to external factors, the economy, bad luck, the incompetence of others, without analyzing their own impulsive decisions or lack of preparation. Not because they are incapable of doing so, but because accepting their responsibility would damage the image they have of themselves as competent. Another strategy is projection. Projection occurs when we attribute to others what we do, not want to recognize in ourselves. If someone has controlling tendencies that contradict their identity as a flexible person, they may constantly perceive others as manipulative. The conflict does not disappear, it simply changes location. Carl Jung described this phenomenon within the concept of the shadow. The aspects of personality that do not fit our conscious identity tend to remain outside the field of awareness, but they do not stop influencing behavior. What is repressed does not disappear. It operates from the unconscious. Self-deception, then, is not a moral failure. It is a protection system. From an evolutionary perspective, maintaining a coherent identity is functional. A stable sense of self allows fast decision-making, maintaining relationships, and sustaining long-term goals. The problem appears when that identity becomes rigid. A rigid identity does not tolerate contradictions, and reality is full of contradictions. When a person perceives themselves as fair, any selfish behavior generates dissonance. When someone defines themselves as strong, any emotion of vulnerability becomes a threat. Instead of integrating that information and expanding identity, the psychological system chooses to distort it. Here a key point appears. Self-deception does not operate only in major decisions. It operates in daily micro-justifications. I didn't exercise because I was too tired. I didn't call because they didn't call either. I didn't move forward because it wasn't the right time. Each phrase may be partially true, but clinical analysis does not stop at the surface of the explanation. It examines the function it serves. Does it protect an identity? Does it avoid an emotion? Does it reduce a feeling of incompetence? Self-deception works as an emotional shock absorber. It reduces the immediate impact of guilt, shame, or insecurity. However, that relief has a cost. It prevents behavioral correction. If the real cause is never recognized, the pattern repeats. Repetition is not coincidence. It is internal coherence. A person who perceives themselves as a victim will tend to interpret ambiguous events as confirmation of that identity. A person who perceives themselves as misunderstood will tend to select evidence that reinforces that narrative. This is not a conscious conspiracy. It is a confirmation bias oriented toward preserving the self. This is where self-deception becomes structural. It not only explains past decisions, it begins to shape future perceptions. The brain filters information. It amplifies what confirms identity and minimizes what contradicts it. This process happens automatically, and the longer it remains, the harder it becomes to detect. Self-deception does not shout. It does not present itself as an obvious lie. It feels reasonable. That is its most dangerous trait. In this first part, we have established the mechanism: identity, threat, dissonance, defense, distortion. The question that remains open is inevitable. If the system is designed to protect identity, how does it manifest in everyday life? In which areas does it usually operate with greater intensity? That is what we will analyze next. If you are enjoying the video, like and share the video. Let's continue. If self-deception is a system for protecting identity, then we must ask something uncomfortable. In which moments does it activate most strongly? The answer is clear from clinical analysis. It intensifies when personal value is at stake. Relationships, work, status, competence, morality. We do not deceive ourselves about what is irrelevant. We deceive ourselves about what sustains our self-esteem. In relationships, for example, self-deception often takes the form of selective reinterpretation. A person may ignore obvious signs of disinterest because accepting reality would imply questioning their value. Instead of recognizing that the other person is not committed, they construct an alternative narrative. They are busy. They are going through a difficult time. I should be more understanding. It is not naivety. It is preservation of the self. In the professional environment, something similar happens. When someone fails repeatedly in the same pattern, bad financial decisions, constant conflicts with superiors, abandoned projects, the explanation usually points toward external factors. The environment becomes the permanent responsible party. The problem with this strategy is that it generates an illusion of coherence. If the world is the problem, the self remains intact. But the pattern persists. Here, another important clinical element appears: the secondary gain. Secondary gain is what self-deception indirectly protects. It not only avoids a painful emotion, it also maintains a familiar psychological position. For example, maintaining the victim narrative may offer a form of emotional legitimization. It avoids assuming full responsibility and at the same time justifies inaction. Giving up that narrative implies facing something more difficult. The possibility that change depends on oneself. The mind evaluates costs, and many times the emotional cost of accepting the truth is perceived as higher than the cost of maintaining the distortion. This phenomenon is deeply related to what Leon Festinger described as cognitive dissonance. When two beliefs or a belief and a behavior come into conflict, the mind does not always change the behavior. Frequently, it modifies the interpretation of facts to restore coherence. We do not change what we do. We change the story about what we did. The problem worsens when identity becomes rigid. A flexible identity can integrate new information. I was wrong. I was impulsive. I didn't handle it well. That flexibility allows adjustment and growth. In contrast, a rigid identity perceives any mistake as an existential threat. It is not "I made a mistake." It is, "If I accept this, I stop being who I think I am." At that point, self-deception stops being occasional and becomes structural. It begins organizing the complete perception of reality. A clinical pattern is then observed. Repetition of similar conflicts in different contexts. The people change, the scenarios change, but the outcome is familiar. The person usually says, "This always happens to me." However, they rarely formulate the inverse question: what constant element am I contributing to this result? Self-deception protects precisely that question. Here we must make an important distinction. The objective is not to completely eliminate defense mechanisms. All psychological systems need them to some degree. Without defense mechanisms, constant exposure to guilt, shame, or uncertainty would be overwhelming. The problem is not the defense, it is the lack of awareness of it. When self-deception becomes invisible, it directs behavior without being questioned. So how is the mechanism interrupted? Not through aggressive self-accusation. That only strengthens the defense. If you directly attack identity, the system will close with greater force. The break begins with structured observation. In clinical terms, it involves separating identity from behavior. You are not your mistake. You are someone who made a mistake. You are someone who made a mistake. That distinction reduces the threat and allows analysis. Another strategy is detecting repetitive patterns. If an explanation appears with identical frequency across different events, others don't understand me. It wasn't the right time. It wasn't the right place. It is worth examining the function that narrative serves. The correct question is not, "Is this explanation true?" The question is, what is this explanation protecting? When a person begins to ask that question honestly, self-deception loses stability. But the process is uncomfortable. Accepting real responsibility implies going through shame, uncertainty, and at times, grief for the previous image of oneself. It is a small identity collapse, and not everyone is willing to go through it. That is why self-deception is so persistent. It is not intellectual weakness, it is emotional resistance. Paradoxically, psychological growth requires tolerating that discomfort. It implies allowing identity to update itself. It is not about destroying the self, but expanding it. A broader identity can say, I wanted to see myself as competent, but I acted from insecurity. I consider myself fair, but I was selfish. I believe I am strong, but I am afraid. That integration reduces the need for distortion. At this point, self-deception loses its dominant function because identity is no longer fragile. It can absorb contradictions without collapsing. And here is the clinical conclusion. Self-deception does not disappear when we discover the truth. It disappears when identity becomes flexible enough to hold it. If identity is rigid, the mind will lie to protect it. If identity is flexible, the mind can correct itself. The final question is not whether you deceive yourself. Everyone does. The question is another. Is your identity broad enough to tolerate an uncomfortable truth? Because if it isn't, your mind will keep doing what it has always done. Protecting you, even if the price is repeating the same story again and again. There is a video you might like at the top. Discover what it is about. See you in that video.